13今天非常美妙的时刻。
And I don't want to forget to thank Tencent for making the slides and the smart people we have in the projection.
谢谢 Tencent 帮我今天做今天的这个幻灯片，我们楼上我们的1.2公。
So when there's some confusion, I always feel relaxed having these very bright young people running the projection.
当我们下面过的时候，我们楼上的media提供都会很快的反应。
They will get it right.
谢谢他们。
And also thanks, of course, to Carl, Professor Chang for translating.
今天有上弟兄给我们做翻译。
Well, in our church today, we have the Chinese church. We have 3 beginnings.
我们在教会里面，明年有3个可以讲是新年。
We have 3 New Years.
3个新的开始。
We have a January 1 New Year.
1月1号。
We have a Chinese New Year.
中国新年。
And we have a new academic beginning.
每年学年的学年度的一年。
So as we begin this new academic year,
我们今年开始我们新的学年度的年的时候
what goals do you have?
我们设立什么样的目标呢？
Today we want to look at a passage in the scripture in which the Lord talks about what he really wants from us.
所以我们今天从今天读的经文里面，我们大家来思考一下，神真正要我们要向我们要什么。
And the passage you just heard read is from the book of Micah in the Old Testament.
我们刚才读就是旧约弥迦书。
So just a bit of background.
给一点背景资料。
Micah was a prophet who lived long ago, about more than 700 years BC.
弥迦这个先知，他是大概西元前8世纪的一个先知，是在南国。
And God spoke through him to the people of Israel.
神就借着他向以色列百姓说话。
This book of Micah is actually a very famous book.
实际上这是非常有名的一本书。
Because when King Herod asked the visiting delegation from the east, where is the newborn king to be born?
希律王问说，这个新生的这个犹太人的王要生在哪里呢？
The teachers of religious law quoted him a verse from the book of Micah.
所以在那个希律王那时候，他们就想到在先知弥迦他所做的预言，弥迦书。
And today we want to look at another section.
我们现在看弥迦书里面的另外一段。
What God was talking to his people about.
神对当时的以色列百姓。
In the book of Micah, he says, I brought you out of Egypt where you were slaves.
所以就在这里，先知提醒以色列民，当年神怎么样把他们从以色列做奴隶的环境里带出来。
And I provided you everything you need.
已经给你们所有人所需要的。
But over the generations, they had forgotten
一
God.
代一代过去，他们就忘了当时神对他们所有的贡献。
And they were, I would say in English, going through the motions. Did stuff on the outside, but it didn't mean much.
他们在敬拜神的时候，他们有外表所有的动作。
So as I thought about this, I thought I want to ask you a question. What if there was someone you thought was your friend, and then later you realized maybe he was only doing things to get something from you?
思想这个问题的时候，我就想问各位一个问题：如果有一个人认为是你的好朋友，他外表上对你非常好，但是他内心对你的想法却是不一样。
And you began to realize he had a different attitude on the inside than he showed you on the outside.
所以他里外就表里不一，他里面对你有想法，他外在却好像是你的好朋友。
How would you feel?
你会怎么样的感觉呢？
This passage today is telling us that God has feelings.
这段经文就告诉我们，神实际上是有情感的感觉的。
The Bible says we are made in the image of God.
神说，圣经里面说，我们是照着神的形象造的，
And we have feelings.
我们也有感情、有情感。
So maybe we can infer God also has feelings.
我们既然是照了神的形象造了，所以我们实际上可以想象，神也有情感这个感觉。
And God has feelings about his people who have forsaken him.
所以他就是知道的，如果他的百姓如果有忘记他的话，神是有感觉的。
So in Micah's time, the people actually were very religious.
事实上，在弥迦那个时代呢，当时以色列事实上是还是非常有宗教性的。
They offered all these sacrifices.
还有献祭。
Animals they slaughtered and they burned incense and so forth.
他们杀牛杀羊，他们献燔祭。
But mostly, they did it on the surface.
但是他们就是在做表面功夫而已。
They were doing things on the outside, but on the inside, their attitude really was not.
外表看起来敬虔，他们内心的态度却是不一样。
So God says that He felt hurt.
所以神感觉就有这受伤的感觉了。
He felt hurt just like we might feel hurt if we thought someone was our friend, and it turned out they were not.
我们可以说，就像当我们的好朋友伤害我们的话，我们是什么样一个感觉
When I was growing up in Texas as a teenager,
在德州长大是当我还是年轻人的时候
I lived in a small town in Texas.
住在德州一个小城里面。
And in those days, many years ago, everybody went to church.
在那个时间呢，每个人都到教会去。
It was the social thing to
教
do.
会是大家社交的一个地方。
But I knew that some people seemed to be one way on the outside, but really on the inside they were
有些
different.
人我就看到有些人好像外表敬虔，但是内心好像就不一样。
Because I could see how they treated people. They talked behind their back or they said bad things.
他在面前表现非常的友善，但是他背后却说人家话。
To the person's face, they would say, "Oh, glad to meet you."
在面前他们是非常的恭敬，非常的温文尔雅，
But then later they might say, "Oh, that guy's no good."
背后却讲人家坏话。
So when I read this passage, it brings back memories that I had of seeing hypocrisy.
所以从这个经文里面，我想到当年年轻的时候，我就意识到这个伪君子这个话的意思。
The word in English, hypocrite, came from a Greek word long ago.
这个字根是希腊的一个字根，
Originally, the word meant it had a good meaning.
开始是实际上是一个好的字眼。
It meant someone who was playing a part, an actor who was acting like somebody in a play.
就说好像是就是一个像演员一样，演那个戏剧里面的一个角色。
But eventually, the word came to have a negative meaning.
后来呢，就有一些就不好的意思就加到这个字根里面去了。
It meant somebody who was playing a part but trying to trick other people.
就变成说好像他是在演一个角色，但是去对人家就是去欺骗人家。
So outwardly, the people that I grew up with and the people in Micah's day, they lacked an inner heart for God.
所以我那时候在我们那时候的教会，我看到就是人的内心事实上是不一样的，跟外表金钱的外表不一样。
They lacked an inner motivation toward God.
里面好像没有一个敬拜神的动机。
And I'm going to ask Wen now to read this passage. You heard it and you read it in Chinese. She will read it.
现在未来我们再念一次。
Micah 6:6-8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
所以这里弥迦书6章8节里面，我们再念一次：我朝见耶和华，在至高神面前跪拜，当献上什么呢？7个献1岁的牛犊为燔祭吗？耶和华岂喜悦天天的公羊，或是万万的油和吗？我岂可为自己的罪过献我的长子吗？为心中的罪恶献我生所生的吗？世人啊，耶和华已指示你何为善，他向你所要的是什么呢？只要你行公义，好怜悯，存谦卑的心，与你的神一起。
So God is saying He desires a proper attitude inside of us.
这里神就是说，要我们心里面要存一个正确的一个态度。
He desires an inner attitude more than sacrifices we do on the outside.
内心出来一个正确的一个态度来敬拜神，比我们在外面献祭宰牛宰羊更重要。
So I remember when I was growing up, there was one man I knew of. He was active in the church, on the church board.
实际上，在我长大的这个教会里面呢，实际上有一个人呢，他是在教会的长执会服侍。
But I knew because he was the father of my good friend. I knew that he was something else when he was at home.
但是我知道这个人回到家里以后呢，因为他的儿子是我的好朋友，所以我知道他在家里是一个什么样的状况。
So we can do deeds that are good, or we can do work in the church that's good, but we can do it with the wrong attitude.
所以我们可以在外面好像有善行，在教会里面有服侍，但是我们的态度可能是不对的。
Now, back in the 5th century, there was a man named, you've heard of him, Saint Augustine.
在5世纪，这个圣徒奥古斯丁，大家也许听过，
Or sometimes he is called Augustine.
就是奥古斯丁这个圣徒。
And Augustine said he was one of the greatest theologians in the Western church.
实际上，他在当年是在欧洲的西方的教会里面，他是一个神学家。
He said in a sermon once, he said, "You ask what you should offer to God."
他在正道有一次他说：“你要问神，神跟你要什么呢？”
He says, "You should offer yourself."
你要跟神奉献什么呢？他说：“你要把你自己奉献上去。”
He said, "What else does the Lord seek but you?"
神向你要的是什么呢？难道不是就是你这个人吗？自己。
And this is what Micah is talking about in this passage in chapter 6.
这就是弥迦书在这个6章里面所讲的。
So he says to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
这边就说你要行公义，好怜悯，存谦卑的心，这是东西。
So as Wynn and I talked about this, we said we don't want to say these are 3 new rules.
跟未来当然今天的正道的时候，我们说这不是3个那个新的规定。
So we don't want people going away and saying, okay, rule 1, justice, rule 2, mercy, rule 3, humility.
希望他不要今天讲到以后会说，今天这个第1条是要行公义，第2条是要好怜悯，第3条是存谦卑的心。
Because we decided these 3 things are really not independent of each other.
实际上这不是3个独立的规条，
They are interrelated.
中间都是有关系的。
And what God asks for us is an inner heart attitude so that whatever we do is out of respect and love for Him.
所以神要求的是让我们内心的正确的态度，我们就会行出这些事情。
And one reason I like this passage in Micah 6
我喜欢这段经文，
is because I have a strong sense of justice.
因为我心里面好像有一个很强烈的一个正义感。
When I see something that is done unjustly, bells and things ring off inside me and I get angry.
所以我如果看到外面有不公义的事情的话，我全身就发抖，我就很生气。
But that isn't usually a good thing for me.
当然，这个对我来说是一个好事。
Some things I cannot control.
有些事情我没办法控制，
So maybe something in the society or the government or people doing evil things.
我们看在社会上，或者是政府，或者说有些人做一些不好的事情，
And those things I really can't change much.
你没办法去改变那些事情。
But there are some things that I can control.
但是有些事情我自己可以控制的，
So I need to ask, what is my part?
你就必须问我自己能够做什么。
You know, there's a famous psalm. When you get angry, you should turn to Psalm 37.
诗篇37篇的话，生气的话，就可以到诗篇37篇开始。
And there's another one, Psalm 73.
诗篇第73篇，
These two psalms often have helped me.
这两个诗篇常常帮助37和73。
And I'm not going to read them here, but Psalm 37 starts out, it says, this is old English I learned, fret not thyself. Don't be worried, don't get angry because of evildoers.
虽然世上有不公义、有邪恶的事情，但是你不要fret，
Fret is get angry.
不要生气。
So as I look back on my career, I see how God moved me at times to do justice in places where I could make a difference.
所以在我长大的时候，神可以教导我怎么样在绝对有不公义的地方去尽一份力。
So as Wynn and I talked about this over breakfast one day, she said, you should tell these stories.
所以我们在吃早饭的时候，我有跟你说，你应该把这个故事讲出来。
So I may get a little embarrassed, but I'm going to tell you 3 stories.
这样就有点尴尬了，跟你讲我自己亲身的三个故事。
The first begins about 50 years ago.
50年前第一个故事。
In the United States at that time, there was a lot of political and social upheaval.
对于在50年前的时候，美国社会是在一个动荡不安的时代。
People were protesting the war in Vietnam.
那时候有反战的示威，
And at the same
有民权的运动。
And at the same time, there was a strong civil rights movement among the black people.
特别是黑人，他们有很多民权运动在1960年代。
And they were protesting injustice of slavery, or it had been slavery years ago.
他们对黑人的他的民权、他的权利有很多的各种运动。
So at that time, there were some places that were not very safe to go.
实际上有很多地方是让你去那里不是很安全的，因为暴动。
I was a new assistant professor in physics.
我是一个刚刚出道的物理教授。
And the American Institute of Physics sent a letter out.
所以美国物理学会就送了一个信出来。
Okay, this is before internet, before email, none of that. You just got these letters that had a little stamp on it.
实际上就是平常所谓收到一封信，也不是在网上，就是确实收到的这么一封信。
So many people, many professors said, "Oh, we need to stop injustice."
很多教授说呀，我们要主张正义。
And this letter said, "We want people to volunteer to go for a few days, visit a black institution, and help those people."
这封信就呼吁物理学家和物理教授说，我们需要一些人到一个危险的地方的黑人居住的一个场。
So go
一
give
个大学。
go give some lectures in physics, talk to some students, talk to the faculty, try to encourage them.
这个地方呢，就是我们物理学教授可以去那边跟学生谈物理啊，或者跟他们交谈。实际上是当初是里面起沸点的一个地方，有民权运动。
But I thought, oh, all of the professors talk about doing things against injustice, so they will never need me.
所以我就想呢，大家每个人都在那边购谈，也许我自己没有办法帮上什么忙。
But I wrote a letter back and I said, I would be willing to go if you need me.
所以，但是我就回应了，我说如果你需要我的话，我愿意去。
And I sent it off to the American Institute of Physics in Washington, D.C.
就把那个信就回信就继续了，寄到这个美国物理学会。
But to my surprise, I got a letter back. It says, "Good, we're sending you to the top institute, Tuskegee Institute in Alabama."
但是呢，美国物理学会是呢这个，对我来讲是很惊讶的事情，他们就选了我，要我去这一个地方叫做
Tuskegee, yeah,
学院，
it's an American Indian name.
是很有名的一个地名，去 Google 一下的话，可以发生一些重要的事情。
So I went,
我说我就去了，
and it was the spring of 1969.
1969年，
There was a lot of instability in the country,
所以有很多动荡不安的事情发生，
but I felt I should do that.
所以我就去了。
So I took 4 airplanes,
我
4 airplanes to get there.
换了四趟飞机，
We flew from Des Moines to, I don't know, Kansas City and somewhere else. The planes got smaller and smaller.
是吧？换了飞机越换越小，换了4趟，终于到了那个地方。
But finally I got to Tuskegee Institute, which is in a small town in Alabama, southeast.
在阿拉巴马州一个很小的一个城，
And it was very interesting because it was all black people. I was not.
到那里去呢，发现我是唯一不是黑人，
But they treated me very, very kindly, and I had a good visit.
但他们对我非常的好，非常友好，非常友善的，我觉得是相当珍惜那段时间。
I won't tell you today, but my whole career changed because of that visit.
实际上对我来讲，我的人生实际上就改变了，因为那一次的访谈。
So, very briefly, I was doing very pure research in physics, and I learned some things there. I wanted to help people in Iowa, like the man there, George Washington Carver, had helped people in Alabama.
对我来讲呢，我是做纯理论研究的，但是心里内心是想要帮助人。学校有很有名的一个黑人教授在叫做华盛顿，可以知道在这个学校里面有很多他的事迹啊，就像那位黑人教授想要帮助人一样。
And you probably know George Washington Carver graduated from Iowa State
就是华盛顿卡这位教授事实上是我们本校的一个
I don't know, a century ago or more.
大概100年前。
And I think he was a genius with plants and things. Peanut and soybean.
他这样把那个花生啊，他很有名的这个植物学家，他把那个花生做成各种产品。
And I also found he was a strong Christian,
同时也是个很好的基督徒，
and he wanted to help the people, very poor people of that area.
他是要帮助人的。
So that put an idea in my mind, and later on I switched fields into another field, atmospheric physics.
后来我就换了我的领域，我就从物理转到大气物理。
The second story is not very long after that, a black student came to Iowa State, and I received him, a PhD student.
大概又过了10年，有一个黑人的一个学生来到大学，州立大学，要读博士班。
And we became good friends, and he was the first black PhD in physics.
我们就变成很好的朋友，他是我们系里面第一个黑人的博士学士。
Today he is the chairman of a physics department.
他后来变成一个物理系的系主任。
The third story is about a woman named Anne.
第三个故事就是有一个女学生，她的名字叫 Anne。
This was about 40 years ago.
这大概是40年前。
At that time, there were very few women in physics.
那时候很少有妇女来读物理。
Only one woman had received a PhD in physics in many decades before that.
当然之前是总共只有一个女的博士，系里面的。
This woman named Anne had moved to Iowa with her husband, who was teaching chemistry in Des Moines.
这个 Anne 呢，她就是移到爱荷华州呢，她先生是教化学。
And she already had 2 or 3 children, several.
她那时候已经2、3个小孩了。
So she wanted to do physics.
她想要读物理。
But she was physics professors and nobody would take her as a student.
她拜访了很多物理教授，还没有人要收她做学生。
Because she had these small children and she wanted to be available to her family and children, so she couldn't work 1,000 hours a week in the laboratory.
所以大家知道做妈妈要做学生的困难，所以她已经2、3个小孩了，所以她没办法花那么多时间在学业上。
But she came to me and we worked out a plan.
所以她在跟我谈以后，我们就制定了一个计划。
Why didn't she just sit in her home with her computer and on the internet?
所以我们说，那你就坐在你自己的家里去做学问吧。
There was no internet.
那时候坐在家里，但是那是并没有网络。
At that time, almost no one had a personal computer.
没有人有个人电脑。
So you had to come here and use these cards and put them in a big building in Iowa State to run a program.
所以那时候不是要办好的，所以他要来这电脑的程序要到学校里面来打卡，才能够跑这个电脑程序。
But we worked out a plan where she could come to Iowa State a couple of times a week and talk it over with me what she was doing. The rest of the time she worked in her home and with her children coming from school or somewhere very little. And she worked, in those days, they worked with pencil and paper.
所以那时候呢，他们就是妇女非常艰难的，她要回去照顾小孩，然后也同时要学业。
Eventually she got her PhD.
最后呢，她还是把这个博士念完了。
Today she is about to retire.
现在都快要退休了。
And she is a world famous scientist with NASA in Washington, D.C.
那美国太空总署在华盛顿，它是非常有名的一个大数据。
And she heads up a big department of meteorological satellite.
那它是一个很大的一个单位的一个主管。
So maybe I can't change many unjust things that I see or hear about in the world.
所以我看到了很多不公义的事情，也许我没办法做太多事情。
But there are some things maybe I can change.
但是有些事情可以做。
And I can act justly.
可以行公义。
And another thing that God said was to love mercy,
另外
kindness.
就是说要好怜悯。
But think of a time when you were very needy.
有时候你会觉得你好像很欠缺，
Maybe you were in a new place and you don't know how to do things, or
到了一个新的地方，不知道要做什么，
and someone helped you.
突然就有人来帮你，
Or maybe they were just kind to you.
他只是也许就是对你好。
I remember several times where someone just smiled at me and it was so helpful. I felt so needy.
有时候你到一个陌生地方，就是有人给你微笑，就觉得是你的保护。
So to love mercy, it means to be aware of people who need mercy.
所以什么叫好怜悯呢？就是要看你周遭是不是有人需要怜悯。
And then the third thing was to walk humbly with your God.
第三件就是说要在怎么样能够就是谦卑与神同行。
Now, walking is a metaphor.
这里说与神同行这个 walk 的英文字呢，它是一个隐喻，它是一个形而上的一个。
It's a word picture. It's a word picture of traveling along your
来
life.
就是一个描述的一个方法，跟神一起行路。
So walking humbly with your God means to live surrendered to God's will.
所以与神同行的话，就是说把自己向神完全顺服。 与神一起走这个三十道路。
So what is humility? Well, it's the opposite of being arrogant.
什么叫存谦卑的心呢？这就是一个自大自夸的心的一个反义词。
And a person who's arrogant doesn't care about anybody else.
一个自大的人不关心别人，
They're just stepping on other people to
这才会让
So humility is caring about other people.
所以谦卑的心呢，就是要能够知道别人别人的需要。
And that's why we think these three things are really interrelated.
所以这三件事情事实上是息息相关的。
Because someone who is arrogant is not likely to be merciful or to help in some unjust situation.
所以一个自大的人，他心里面自大的话，他没办法存谦卑的心，就不能够行公义方面。
It means living in humility, giving yourself over to the will of God.
也就是说，你要活在一个有谦卑心的谦卑的心活在这世界上，把你自己奉献给神。
It may be little things or it may be big things.
你可以是很小的事情，也可以是一个很大的事情。
And here we have this wonderful model that Jesus gave us.
这种就跟他耶稣基督去做这个好的榜样。
And you know the famous story where Jesus is in the garden before he is betrayed to his death.
当耶稣基督被卖的那一夜，你知道他是在克西玛丽园里面。
And he says to his father, he's praying, and he says, if there's any way that I don't have to do this, nevertheless, your will be done, not mine.
所以耶稣基督在克西玛丽园被卖的那一夜，是让他的祷告是说，如果这个杯可以离开的话，但是不要照我的意思，不要照你的意思，跟天父这样祷告。
And I'm sure that as a Christian goes along, as you go along your life journey, there will be times where you will say, Lord, I don't want this, whatever the situation is. But
也许我们基督徒在我们的道路上，常常有碰到同样的情况，我们说神啊，我不需要走上这样的道路，神啊，能够让我不走的话，不上这条道路请帮助。
It might be something related to health or job or relationships with people.
可能是我们健康，可能是我们工作上，或者我们对关系上。
But we can say to God, it hurts, Lord, but I want your will to be done.
虽然你觉得伤害，但是你也可以跟神祷告说：“神啊，不要照我的意思，只要照你的意思。”
And this will touch our God, our Father's heart.
我们都这样祷告的话，我们就会打动天父的心。
God cares about our heart.
神实际上是非常在意我们心里面心怎么想的。
He cares about our heart more than our outward actions that other people see.
我们内心怎么想法，内心的态度，实际上比我们外在行为不一样。
So if I could have the next slide, please. Proverbs 4:22. So this is a verse. I think this is one of Wynn's favorite verses.
就是福音呢，很喜欢的一句经文。
It's a good one. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it.
一段很有名的经文就是说，你要保守你心，胜过保守一切，因为一生果效是由此而出。
I want to end with a story that about Jesus' life.
这里我再讲一个，就是基督他在世上的故事。
This is a famous story that you know about.
这故事大家也都知道。
It's where someone, a professor of religion or a teacher of the law, came to Jesus and said, "What is the greatest commandment?"
这个是在马可福音里面一个文士来到耶稣面前，问他说：“所有的诫命里面最大的是哪一条？”
And this teacher of the law asked him about this, even though most of those religious professors were angry with Jesus.
这个文士来问耶稣基督的时候呢，是已经很多文士呢对耶稣基督有点生气。
But Jesus noticed this man asked not in an arrogant way.
但是耶稣基督发现这个文士问的问题呢，是没有带着一个自大、狂妄的心。
So when the man said, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Get when to read.
所以这个文士就问：所有的诫命最大的是哪一条？
Mark 12, verses 29 to 31. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
And the next slide, please. There should be one more slide.
就是这样。这是对的。
There's a couple of more verses from the same story.
Oh, there it is.
32
Mark 12, 32 to 34. Well said, teacher, the man replied. To love him, God, with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God.
所以是马可福音12章29节到34节里面是这样说：耶稣回答说，第一要紧就是说，以色列啊，你要听主我们的神是独一的主，也要尽心、尽性、尽意、尽力爱主你的神。其实就是说要爱人如己，再没有比这两条诫命更大的。那文士对耶稣说，不是说神是一位，实在不错，除了他以外，再没有别的神，并且尽心尽智尽力爱他，又爱人如己，就比一切凡祭和各样祭祀好得多。耶稣见他说道，有智慧就对他说：“你离神的国不远了。”
I like this story because this illustrates the two ways to ask questions.
我很喜欢这个故事，因为这个故事呢，教导我们有两种方法来问这个问题。
Some people ask a question to tear down the other person.
有人问问题，目的是要把对方击倒。
But this man asked Jesus a question, and he really wanted to know the answer.
这个文士问的问题是他是真的想要知道答案。
And when he heard Jesus answer, the man said back, he said, You have spoken well. He said, because it's more important to love your neighbor than all of the sacrifices that you can make.
就是文士听到了答案，同时也了解了，他同时回应说，要爱人如己，就是一切凡祭或者祭祀的好处。
And then when Jesus saw this man had answered well, he said, You are not far from the kingdom of God.
所以耶稣对他的评论就是说，他回答非常的好，他离神的国不远。
What a wonderful statement.
这是非常好的一个说法。
What if Jesus said that to you?
如果耶稣就对你说你离神的国不远了，会怎么想？
What if he said, You're close to the kingdom of God?
所以如果耶稣说你离神不远了。
So what God cares about is our attitude more than doing things for outward show.
所以很重要的是，我们内心是怎么样一个态度来 敬拜神，不是不坏的。
I wonder if I missed one slide. Is there another slide before this one? Maybe I confused things. Maybe here it is. Okay. So what God cares about most is our attitude, not outward show.
就是这里说，上帝最在乎的不什么外在的外在行为，但是内在的。
And now Lynn is going to come with her takeaway.
像未来的我们继续他们的奋斗。
Krishna, could you please have the first slide of Micah 6:6-8 again? Oh, there it is. Wonderful. Let's listen again to the scripture for today. And let's read again, and I will read again, Micah 6:6-8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
我们再一次的来看以迦书六章6到8节，这边说：“我朝见耶和华，在至高神面前跪拜，当献上什么呢？岂可献10000的牛犊为燔祭吗？耶和华岂喜悦千千的公羊，或是万万的油和吗？我岂可为自己的罪过献我的长子吗？为心中的罪恶献我身所生的吗？世人啊，耶和华已指示你何为善，他向你所要的是什么呢？只要你行公义，好怜悯，存谦卑的心，与你的神同行。”
Let's take 2 or 3 minutes now to ask ourselves, what is God saying to me in these verses?
我们大家就在这个经里面，我们也可以跟静默2、3分钟，看看神在这我们心中，在我们生命里面来用。
We'll just have a couple of minutes of silence.
2、3分钟的时间。
So what is God saying to us today?
今天神跟我们说什么呢？
Maybe God is saying to us, come to me.
也许神说：“来我这里吧，
Let me carry your burdens and give you rest.
让我来担负你的重担，给你安息。
Trust me, depend on me,
信任我的，
not on your own attempts to gain my approval.
不要用你自己的意图、自己的力量来得到我的赞赏。
I made you and I have gifted you to serve me.
神说：我需要你，我已经给你的恩赐，让你来服侍。
Let my spirit produce his character in you.
也就让神他的圣灵能够让我们有神的性格。
So that you can treat others as I ask.
所以你在对待别人的话，当我要你去对待别人的时候，
With fairness and with mercy.
你就有公义。
Let me give you grace to walk humbly with me.
也就给你恩典让你能够与我 让你能够从谦卑的心里同行。
Let me guide and bless your choices, your agendas, your plans.
神就说，让我来引领你，让我给你一些你看的点，让我能够知道你怎么样计划你自己的人生。
My ways are higher than your ways,
我的道路高过你的道路，
and you can trust me because I love you and I live in you.
你可以信靠我，因为我爱你，因为我愿意住在你里面。
Let's pray together.
然后低头一起祷告。
Our Father, before we begin a new academic year tomorrow, we have listened to your voice today.
天父啊，我们要开始新的学年度，我们愿意在这里倾听你的声音。
Some of us are excited, anticipating new things.
我们中间也许觉得很兴奋，是有一些新的事物会发生。
Some of us feel burdened with many responsibilities and difficult work ahead.
我们中间也许觉得有负担，然后有重担，也觉得有这个责任，有困难的事情。
Some of us are experiencing loss and have heavy hearts.
我们也许中间有一些觉得失落，或者我们心情沉重。
Some of us have fears and questions about unknown events in the days ahead.
你在往前看的时候，也许我们心中有恐惧有问题，不知道将来会发生什么事情。
So we come to you, Father, as we are.
我们就在这面前，就是我们现在这个样子。
We're clay pots with a treasure inside.
我们虽然是瓦器，我们里面却有宝贝。
You already know everything in our hearts, even the things we don't want to look at.
你已经完全知道我心里面所想的，有些事情是让我自己都不想知道。
We bring all these things to you,
我把心里所有的事情都带到你面前。
and we want to walk humbly with you, just as you are already walking with us, around us, and ahead of us.
我们就愿意用谦卑的心与你同行，就像你已经在以往都已经跟我们同行，你在我们的周围，你在我们前面引领。
What a privilege we have to be your children.
这是多大的一个权利，我们成为你的子女。
Thank you for blessing us, guarding us, smiling on us.
谢谢你祝福我们，保护我们，向我们微笑。
We pray in Jesus' powerful name.
我们在耶稣基督万能得胜的名